it arrives because if we orient the building onto that passive solar south, we're seeing that the house is really a sort of a clock. So then we can realize that when buildings are designed on paper or on the computer, you only acknowledge 2 dimensions of an actual 4-dimensional reality. That when the architecture is constructed, that it engages these 4 dimensions. And those 4 dimensions of length, breadth, height, and time are the 4 dimensions of the universe as we know it. So this is really the power of the architecture, that it allows us to engage with these 4 dimensions of the world as we know it. Why is the built environment so bad? It's because they only ever take 2 dimensions into account when it's being created. And yeah, it's assembled then on site and it's oriented maybe not to the sun, that it'll still acknowledge those other dimensions, but where they're not harmonized, you're not receiving the full potential of the architecture. All of these things were known instinctively by people. So for example, in the Irish vernacular architectural tradition, you would learn this by virtue of being part of a community. This is what you would experience. Somebody would be building a house, you'd go and you'd give a hand, and you'd learn it, and you'd see the guy stepping it out. Okay, it's 7 steps this way, and it's 5 steps that way, and this is the sheltered spot where we're going to push it, and the sun is over there. That is how the knowledge was passed down. It was never written down. It was always an oral tradition. But they were also tied in with just people's sense of identity and culture. That's where art arrives from, is people decorating their houses or decorating themselves. The whole world of storytelling, music, poetry, all of that, all linked into the shelter making. As long as people were practicing that, people were connected in with their culture and they were connected in with nature because they were just collecting materials that were available locally, natural materials. So what happened? That if we knew how to make shelter, and shelter that now is being looked back at as being models for us to create a new sustainable eco-architecture, how did we shift from being able to do that out of almost no money at all to a situation where young people can't afford to have a house because they're too expensive? Like, what actually happened? Like, where's the mystery? What's gone wrong? Well, what seems to have gone wrong is the advent of the Industrial Revolution, introduced the job culture and paid employment. So people basically sold their time for a job and the promise of the machine age. And it's not hard to understand why people were suckered by it. People are still being suckered by it, that the machine age of the fossil fuels are somehow going to deliver all this promise. It's only now we're realizing, after a couple of 100 years, that, oh, hang on a minute, maybe it's not so good. Maybe there are all these problems attached to it that we have to look at. But of course, people surrendered the facility to create their own homes for the promise of so-called better life. And yes, it seemed better for a long time. But in that process, the knowledge of how to do it was forgotten because it was an oral tradition. Very, very quickly, it was forgotten how basically to do it. So it's been this detachment from the facility to make the shelter that was the beginning of this erosion of our connection into the natural world and our connection into a totally different time perspective. Because this is what the fossil fuels have introduced. They've introduced a different time perspective. So we're going from the pre-industrial era where it's that daily rhythm that people are tuned into, and that seasonal variation. So it's the equinox today, sun rises in the east, goes to the south, there's the east, goes to the south, and then sets in the west. And from now on, it's going to be tracking further as the days get longer. It's those natural rhythms that are the natural rhythms of our bodies. You know, it's the sunlight in the morning that activates our pineal gland and wakes us up. So we go into a natural daily rhythm. But the clock is a completely different timepiece. The clock is completely tied into the machine. So the fossil fuels have introduced this false rhythm into our lives. And, of course, the fossil fuels themselves are directly tied into the solar principle. They took millions of years to create. So we get into our car, or we flick on the light switch, or we flick on the heater, and we release all of this energy instantly that took millions of years to create. So we're living in this speeded up world. When we press that accelerator, we're in this different rhythm. And of course we're able to cope with it because our brains are amazing things. But we become detached from the nature of our lives. We don't think we have any time left because we're cramming so much activity into a given portion of time that people don't think that they've any time left. But time doesn't change. The day is still a day, it's just we're doing more stuff in any given portion of time. So the getting up, the shelter making, the embracing of the industrial age, the use of the fossil fuels, it's created this artificial rhythm that everybody is trying to keep pace with. Then when the money has been tied in to the fossil fuels and the money has been tied into people's time, this is where then people get locked into this mad world that we know is destroying itself. So we're in this paradoxical situation that, you know, we're living because we want to live, and that's what the economy is there for. It's to provide people with food and water and shelter and to facilitate our engagement with each other because we all basically want to live. But that very system is destroying life, largely because we've tapped into the fossil fuels that allow us to do way, way more than we're capable of as individuals. So if you go back again to the pre-industrial era, the whole idea of the family and the family home was the survival unit. So we stayed in these clusters of families and communities, and we had, you know, very narrow personal individual lives. The fossil fuels came along and they freed people up to leave home and to travel and everything else because you could replicate what a person could do by using fossil fuels. And of course the machines have such a huge production that the stuff they're producing, people have to consume more and more, or you have to have more and more people. So all of those things have happened. Burgeoning population because the machines need more and more and more people to consume more and more stuff because they're working in a completely different rhythm than human production. So once you get more production, you get more consumption, you get more waste, you get more pollution. It's just a vicious circle. And then the market economy thinks, oh great, we can solve all those problems because it creates lots and lots and lots and lots of business. But it's only a paper construct. On paper it all looks like, wow, that economy can grow and it can grow and it can grow and it can grow. But what that doesn't take into account, that what underpins the money, like what does underpin the money? Like here's some money, you know, all the way from Australia, the daily dollar that I get in my local hardware store in Castlemaine when I go and buy stuff. Money is just a construct. It's just an idea. So when people, for example, borrow money to get a house, which is one of the only ways people can get a house, they're pledging their time, converting their time into money. So they're pledging 30 years of their time in order to have that place to live. And it locks them into the economy because that's what's happened. Planning has been put in place to restrict people's facility to build a house. It is not difficult to build a house. It's relatively simple. It's life that's complicated. So it's this invisible part of making the building that is complicated. This part of it, the physical part of it, is pretty straightforward. So if we get our life stuff sorted, it's very, very easy to make a very simple enclosure, a very simple